All right, I would like to introduce Kathy Lloyd.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Eric. My name is Kathy Field Lloyd. I'm the chair of the forum. The forum is designed to provide opportunities for condo association and HOA members to share best practices for issues that are of concern to all of us. We're a program of the Juno Beach Civic Association, and Donna Hamilton, our president, is here with us today, as well as board members Kathy Dorn and David Cox. In the past, you may already be aware that our meetings have been at the town hall, but of course, the pandemic has changed everything for many of us, and it caused us to need to do things online, and thankfully, that's working out a little better than we had expected. We're all getting used to a new world. We couldn't do this without our corporate sponsor, which is Center State Bank, and our partners today, Chris Banker from Patriot Insurance, and presenters of past and future webinars. It's really a joint effort of many, many people. I hope you'll be able to join us for the next two webinars, which happen to be on the next two Wednesdays. Next Wednesday is board certification at 10 a.m. and the following Wednesday is cable TV and internet options for condo associations and HOAs. So thank you for joining us today, and I'd like you to meet our sponsor, Kathy Dorn from Center State Bank.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathy Dorn. I'm with Center State Bank, and my role at Center State Bank is an association relationship manager. Center State Bank is a premier bank for associations of all types, condominiums, homeowners, and cooperatives. Our services include lockbox services, ACH, bill pay, online cash management, lines of credit, credit cards, term loans for capital improvement projects, a full suite of treasury management services and cash management services. I would look forward to speaking to any of you. I'm also a member of the Juno Beach Civic Association. My contact information can be found on the webpage. I have an office in Palm Beach Gardens in Stewart. I would look forward to speaking with anyone. I always appreciate this opportunity to sponsor these events. I find them very informative and hope that you will also. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Banker, our speaker today with Patriot Insurance. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, Kathy. I do want to thank you and Center State Bank for sponsoring what we think is an incredibly important topic, particularly in these times. Of course, we want to thank Kathy Field Lloyd and the entire Juno Beach Forum. It's a great and important organization and association of folks sharing ideas like the ones we're going to discuss today. So to Kathy Field Lloyd and to Donna Hamilton, thank you. And of course, to the Juno Beach Civic Association for putting the entire thing together. Donna Hamilton, you and your team and your board do a great job. So we really appreciate that. Looking forward to speaking with you today about cyber liability risks and some of the solutions that can impact associations. But before I do that, wanted to go through a couple of little housekeeping matters because, as you know, we're meeting on Zoom. We're meeting virtually today. We would much rather be in an in-person forum, and hopefully those days are returning to us very soon. But in the meantime, we have a really terrific producer of today's event who's helped the Civic Association all throughout this virtual time phase. His name is Eric Rucker, and Eric has a couple of housekeeping matters about today's presentation, and particularly how you will go about asking questions and having them answered. So Eric, take it away.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to let our attendees know that if they do have a question at any point during the presentation, on whatever device that you are joining us from, there's going to be down at the bottom of your toolbar, or wherever your toolbar may be, a little icon that says Q&A. So if at any point during this presentation, if you think of a question that you want to ask, feel free to go ahead and type in your question into that Q&A and send that along to us, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can. So I'm gonna turn this back over to Chris. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Eric. And if for any reason you're not able to ask those questions during the course of the presentation, we will have a question period at the very end, and we'll be happy to take your questions there, time permitting. So as I said, my name is Chris Banker. I'm with Patriot Insurance Agency. We're a property and casualty insurer here in Juno Beach. So we have very close, intimate, and tangible connection to our associations. And those are groups of folks who volunteer and who live in community associations, and we hold those relationships very, very dear. So today's presentation is going to hit right at the heart of some of the emerging and modern risks relative to those associations, particularly in cyberspace. And so let me see if I can utilize what we know, what we call screen sharing in just a moment. And I'm going to launch a PowerPoint presentation, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So when Eric has the screen sharing privileges arranged, we'll do that. But in the meantime, let's talk about insurance generally, because, you know, folks tune into this and say, oh, well, this probably doesn't apply to me. I mean, let's face it, insurance, and especially cyber liability insurance, you know, insurance is the kind of thing that we know we need, but we hope we never get a chance to use. So that's a bit of a paradox, but it's the truth. So folks are naturally resistant to embracing those topics. But, you know, I sometimes think of it like a hospital gown. If you've ever been in one, you know that there's never quite as much coverage as you think you have. So coverage is important. It's important in hospital gowns, but more important in community associations. So without further ado, let's get started. And hopefully you can see my screen at this time. We've entitled this Cyber Liability in Your Association, Protecting Your Ops, OPS, Ops. So we talked about the fact that we're right here in Juno Beach. I'm a native Floridian. I went to Florida State University. I've been in the insurance industry, both on the legal and the retail side, for 30 years. I'm a member of the Florida Bar since 1996, member of all the relevant associations. I'm president of my own condominium association. I'm on the FEMA Floodplain Task Force for Juno Beach. I serve as an expert witness, consultant for insurance and civil litigation matters, and frequently have the privilege, like today, of speaking and presenting on insurance matters. I also love, in my spare time, to teach young people. I coach youth sports. I am a high school speech and debate teacher, and also serve as an adjunct professor for business law at Palm Beach Atlantic University. So what do we do at Patriot Insurance before we jump into the topic? Well, we do pretty much everything, personal lines and commercial lines. And the reason I've highlighted these two aspects, the general liability and the professional liability, is that's really where the cyber liability risk exposure comes in. The general liability, which all of your associations have, and the professional liability, that's the E&O, or as you would refer to it as a board member, the D&O, the directors and officers coverage. That's the coverage that protects you against breaches of the standard of care, failing to do something or doing something that would be outside of what is the generally accepted standards for protecting the association as a fiduciary. So those two items are the key components of cyber liability. So Kathy Field Lloyd, if you could give me a thumbs up, that'll let me know that you see my screen perfectly clearly. And I see you, and thank you very much. So cybersecurity, protecting your ops. What are your ops? Well, maybe you've heard that term before. It's a little quiz. The ancient Roman goddess of plenty and wife of Saturn and mother of Jupiter. Mother of Jupiter. Is that ops? Is that what ops are or is? Is it an internet slang term meaning oops? Is it an abbreviation for office-wide titles in business operations? Is it all of the above? Well, the answer, of course, is all of the above. But we're going to be talking about operational risks today, protecting your ops. Those are the operations of your association. So in risk management, we talk about operational risks, protecting against network or technology failures that prevent your ability to conduct the business and the affairs of your association. So before we go too much further, I want to make sure I'm clear about one thing. I am not a cybersecurity expert. My area of specialty is in the insurance realm. There are many firms locally and nationally who provide cybersecurity expertise, consulting, reviews, and I even have resources, folks that we both insure and have worked with over the years who are excellent in this department. They can help harden your systems personally and for the association against the impending threats of cyber risk. Those are the kinds of things, if you contact me privately, I'd be delighted to connect you with that. But I want to make it clear, I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I'm going to touch on a lot of cybersecurity issues, but those protection pieces are for the firms who deal in that. We handle the liability, the protection of your operation and of your association against failures in your program. So my goal is to discuss how to manage those risks that are associated with failures and to make sure that the cost or the payment for the liability that you might sustain gets shifted from the association and from the board of directors and from the officers over to the insurance company and let them pay those claims, because they can be quite expensive. So we have operational risks. We talked about that, failures for technology and your ability to conduct the business of the association, but also there are privacy risks. And privacy risks are those that protect the owner, the lessor, the property manager, your vendors, and your employees from the exploitation of their information. So that's the P, it's privacy risks. And then S is security risks. Those are protecting your systems against external hacking, phishing, virus, or other system failures. And presumably you have seen or have some knowledge of the kinds of threats that are out there in those regards. I can tell you that there not a week goes by when we don't see somebody who has experienced a breach in one of these three areas. So really, what does that look like? Well, for 2021, it looks different than it did 2 years ago. I can assure you of that. And Don Lorman published an article recently that talked about the top few dangers of operating in cyberspace for 2021. And it's very applicable to our association friends. Here are the top 5. Work from home, that's what WFH is, working from home, which a lot of folks have done over the last year and are going to continue to do into 2021, fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic, is producing more attacks on home computers and networks. These are folks using home offices and other home and personal devices. Well, those are now being used as criminal hubs to be taken advantage of, especially if they have unpatched systems or architecture weaknesses, and those are being exploited on a much more regular basis. Secondly, top danger is the rush to put everything into the cloud. So in the old days, we used to store everything on our computer. Now so much is being stored on, I say the old days, in the recent old days. Now things are being put into the cloud. Well, that comes with it a whole bundle of additional security holes and challenges, including misconfigurations and outages. So how do we protect against those? Ransomware. This is one that probably everyone's familiar with. I think at this point, everyone at least knows somebody who's been affected by a ransomware attack or a malware attack. These are getting worse. Data is being stolen prior to it being encrypted. Malware is being packaged in, and other threats and very specific targeting of organizations. And in particular, homeowners and condominium associations are a target. We're going to talk about why that is. Number 4, mobile devices, including smartphones, are going to be attacked in new ways and have been, including virtual app stores where you go to purchase apps or you buy apps to perform certain functions on your phone or on your laptop. That has been a bit of an open season for the cyber criminals. And then finally, enterprise software and cloud applications that are used for these remote working purposes. Well, critical class bugs have been designed usually by international and foreign nefarious actors, and those are a top area for exploitation. Those are the top 5 dangers of cyberspace in operating in cyberspace in 2021. Incidentally, it reminds me of a little joke. They said the government is still looking for a hacker that they discovered yesterday. They found out that he ran somewhere. Okay, I guess everyone's mute is on because I'm not hearing the kind of laughs, just kidding, that we should be hearing. Ransomware, little pun there. Cyber liability comes in 2 forms, data breach and cyber crime. So we need to make that distinction. Data breaches and cyber crime. Those are 2 decidedly different things, but all fall under the cyber liability umbrella. So what is cyber liability in general? This is when we're talking about your community association, we're talking about the association, the entity itself, that association's exposure to financial consequences, especially from a third party or a member whose information was accessed either due to an act of cyber negligence on the association's part, or by you, or by one of the members, or by even the property management company. So we need to understand the difference between these two things so that we can talk a little bit about cyber liability. So let's take the data breach component of it first. What's a data breach? And I realize that some of these terms are new. Even though you've heard them, we're going to try to dig down and get some good definitions so you have a good feel for it before the end of the presentation. A data breach exposes confidential, sensitive, or protected information to an unauthorized person. The files in a data breach are viewed or shared without permission, and anyone can be at risk of a data breach, from individuals and associations to high-level enterprises and corporations and governments. More importantly, any person, even merely affiliated with the association, can put others at risk if they are not protected. So it's sort of a weakest link in the chain analysis that we have to be aware of. In general, these data breaches happen due to weaknesses either in the technology or the architecture of your cyber systems, or user behavior, weaknesses in either. So one is a hardware technology architecture weakness. The other is simply how people use those things, from their iPhones to the association or the property management system itself. Those are the two general areas of weakness that can lead to a data breach. The other part of it that we wanted to talk about is cyber crime. Now, what's the difference there? Cyber crime is an external threat. That's damage to and from any type of illegal activity that occurs using digital means. So some of these examples you're getting more familiar with, I'm sure, as we all are: extortion, ransomware, phishing, spelled with a PH. Those are the emails that come in and they try to bait you or entice you to click on a link that then implants what we would call conveniently a virus, but really they implant malware onto your system and then go out from there. So that's a phishing attack, social engineering, and even wire transfer fraud. These are very important concepts, and this is the one that really kind of gets our attention, even though data breaches are just as serious and just as important an area of focus. So what are the sources for cyber liability? There are many, but I want you to think about them in two different forms. There are the internal sources and the external sources. So let's break that down a little bit further. What's an internal source for cyber liability? Well, in an association, it can be employees or members. It could even be vendors, but we're going to talk about that in just a second. So keep in mind that we're not talking about necessarily only malicious activity. It can be simply negligent activity or an oversight. So it can come from an internal source. It may or may not be malicious. It might involve merely misusing the systems. It may involve sloppy or lazy behaviors. It might be vicious or vindictive, somebody who was spurned, somebody who's unhappy with something that occurred. There are increasing levels of cyber sabotage, even from inside, from folks who want to cause harm. Now, we would hope that that does not happen and would not happen. We'd like to think that the human spirit would prevail, but we know that in some cases it does not. Now, that does not suggest that that is the overriding or one of the most prolific areas, but it is one to be aware of. So those can take the form of blackmail or other illicit activities or even sabotage. So that's the internal type of threat. Then you have external threats, and these are the ones, again, that everyone's more familiar with. Typically, these are malicious. These are external invaders, and they typically have to bypass some external barrier in order to get to and cause damage to your association or its members. So they do that by stealing data in the form of data theft, or vandalizing the internal architecture of your software, your computers, or those of your property manager. They disrupt services, and obviously, you know, where it can lead from there, it can lead to stealing information, or more importantly, or as importantly, financial information and ultimately money. And then there's social engineering, which is a bit of a hybrid between those two. These are the scams that we're talking about, where the information or the communication is designed from a social engineering perspective to get somebody to click on it, or to launch a link, or to go down a rabbit hole of cyber sabotage or cyber threat that they otherwise would not go down. These are phishing and viruses and other malicious links. So why in the world is this happening in the first place? Well, it might be very obvious to you, but I'd like to review it. Why are community associations so attractive to hackers, and even more so lately? Well, there are two things that they want, especially the external threats, the cyber thieves. They want money. All associations have reserve accounts and operating accounts as required by statute. And vendor payments also that come and go through those accounts need to be protected. So those accounts and money must be protected. Number two, they want unit owner information. That is identity theft and other personal information of people who are part of that community association. What are we talking about here? Well, we mean bank accounts, bank routing numbers, credit card numbers, social security numbers, email addresses, and other things that thieves can use to exploit to get additional data. It becomes a launching pad to get additional data and then go on to stealing identities and depleting bank accounts, and then they're gone. Those are some of the problems we see with regard to unit owner information being taken. And additionally, keep this in mind, many associations may not have the security measures in place that larger organizations have in place. And cyber thieves know that. They know that we don't operate like IBM or Publix or some of these other large corporations, which have very sophisticated cyber architecture in place. Therefore, it's sort of a weakest of the herd mentality. They know that associations have lots of money, lots of members, and usually the least defensive architecture. So it can come in many forms when it comes to community association cyber theft. Let's talk about those, and I'll give you a couple of examples. And there are many, by the way. I had about 20 that I was going to go through, but I thought, good heavens, we'll just deal with some of the main ones. So a typical idea would be a board member, manager, or even just an officer or a committee chairperson losing their iPhone, their cellular device, or their laptop. And that might have either emails, something as simple as emails that they use to communicate with and among other board members, committee members, board members, property managers, etc. Or it might even have something much more significant than that. It might contain a reference to a bank account number or a passcode that would get us into software that then could be exploited. That's very simple. So a device is lost. Second example might be a cyber thief hacking into a property manager's system. Now, property manager, as you know, could be an on-site manager. It could actually be a member of the association, could be an employee of the association, or it could be a third party that handles many, many associations, in which case all of those associations would be at risk if a single member of the property management team were to lose a device that had been connected to association business in some form. So that's where they would go in and steal confidential information about the owners, gain access to the association bank accounts or other. So what are some main areas of vulnerability for community associations? Well, one would be applications. So this is something to keep in mind if you require an application for membership. Membership applications often contain information about the individual unit owner as well as the association. Sometimes the membership will be required to provide leases and other related personal information as part of either their membership or part of having a tenant lease a unit, or any sorts of applications. Those are an area of vulnerability. And of course, you probably know this already, all emails, all electronic communications from newsletters and announcements and reminders and finances and voting, all of those procedures, all of those processes are vulnerabilities because each of them connect through a network and through a web of people that are interconnected and interrelated, and therefore allow entry points to exploit large groups of people throughout the association. Sometimes the infected systems are as simple as somebody's individual cell phone or their individual computer system. Sometimes it's much broader than that. If the association owns its own hardware, has its own computer systems, and it's owned by the association, that is a common area of exploitation. Same with board members, committees, members, and their personal devices. And then property managers, whether they are on-site or off-site, whether they are dedicated or part of a property management company, those systems are ripe for exploitation as well. And then keep in mind, even though we're talking about cyber liability and cyber exposure, mishandled paper files can be just as vulnerable, just as problematic. And I guess I could put in a plug at this moment for the annual Shred Fest that the Juno Beach Civic Association does, where you're welcome to bring those kinds of outdated paper files that contain personal information and have them shredded complimentarily as a compliment, and typically raising money for a really great charity like we did just a couple of weeks ago for the Gold Star families who have lost a loved one in service to our country. So mishandled paper files are an area of vulnerability that need to be managed. And then, of course, websites. That can be the association's own website if they maintain one, whether secured or not, or a property manager's website or portal through which they host an association's website. So there are multiple layers of vulnerability for community associations. And before we jump into some of these types of information and how to kind of drill down on it, I'm going to pause for a second and see if anyone has a question, and then we'll jump back in. I know I'm kind of throwing a lot at you, but I want to break down those areas and make sure that everybody has a pretty good understanding of what we're talking about today, because we're going to move on to solutions here pretty soon. It's a lot to manage, but there are some simple and cost-effective solutions that you can do. So at this time, I don't see any questions, and that's perfectly fine. We will hop back on. Oh, I do. One just popped up. Let's see. This is from David. It says, are vans something condos should use? So I am going to ask David to rephrase that. VPNs. VPNs. Well, let me answer the vans question first. Yes, community associations should use nice vans. I'm just kidding. The VPNs, what is a VPN? Well, VPN is a secured portal to access information remotely, and it's much more secure than some of the free software that a lot of people use, such as you may have heard of TeamViewer or AnyDesk. These are free software programs that allow you remotely to log into your home computer or an association's home computer in this particular case. And the VPN is a different type of portal. It's one that is resident on your own system, on your own server, and it's much more secure. So yes, that is one way that you can very effectively manage or help to effectively manage the access point between a remote computer and a mothership or a home-based computer where you need to access information and you're not in front of that system. VPN, good idea. Thank you for the question. So let's see if we can hop back in here and talk about some types of information that might be at risk. There's non-public information. This is stuff that's completely private and specific to the individual: dates of birth, social security, medical information, HIPAA information, including emergency contacts, assisted living facility information. These are the kind of touch points that cyber thieves love, because once they get a little piece of it, they can use that as a platform or a launching pad to go out into cyberspace and collect additional data until they have enough to steal an identity. There's banking and financial information. We talked about association bank accounts and the banking information and the passwords and account numbers that are associated therewith. But then if you're an association that uses key codes and access codes, barcodes, or provides passes to your vendor, or whether your association a property manager helps you do that, all of those contain the kind of information in order to register and distribute that, if those applications or if those files are accessed, can lead to an incident of cyber liability. So those losses, as you can imagine, as the mind starts to wander and think about these things, you can realize that these cyber theft losses are significant. There are many categories of financial loss and practical operational losses that occur. One is the forensic cost to determine how the breach occurred. That's something that you must do if you have a breach as an association. You got to determine how it happened. Why? Because there are lots of regulatory requirements that we're going to talk about that you must follow And in order to do that, you got to get to the bottom of how it occurred so that you can figure out how far, what the length and the breadth of your response is going to be. That's cost money and time and people. The expenses to fix the problem itself once you get to the root of the issue. The notification costs, remember that word or that phrase, notification costs, because we're going to talk about that in just a second. That's a significant piece of it. Notification costs to all affected or potentially affected parties. And then compensation to individuals if the thieves were successful, if they stole the funds or personal information, that liability, if it was due to a breach by the board or the property management, that liability and exposure financially comes right back to the association. And guess what? It is not covered under your current policy, under a regular general liability policy. So you are self-insuring for that type of financial loss, unless we engage in one of the solutions that I'm going to talk about toward the end of the presentation. Then there's the cost of defending the lawsuits that result from that. If you are responsible for, and I say you, meaning the association or its employees or its members or its property managers, you're going to have to defend any potential lawsuit that comes as a result of somebody having their, or multiple people or multiple entities having identities or other tangibles and intangibles stolen, lost, and the impact of the financial hit to each of those flows back to the association and potentially to the board of directors. So here's one that's difficult to quantify, but it's significant. And believe me, if you end up in a lawsuit and you're in front of the jury on this where you do not want to be, there will be a question to the jury that they need to quantify the significant cost to the association's reputation. So these are things that, the association, if an association is vulnerable to cyber attack and has been attacked or hacked, that makes it that's something that would need to be disclosed, I think. And if so, it can impact the value of a unit. If somebody's trying to sell a unit, it can affect the psyche of somebody who's considering joining the association. So there are difficult to quantify but significant costs to an association's reputation as a result of a breach. Better not to have it. And if you have it, better to have it satisfied quickly and through one of the solutions that we're going to talk about. And then, of course, there are penalties that can be assessed if the association has not complied with state data protection statutes. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. What are some of my options then? So, look, Chris, we have talked about some scary stuff. You've got my attention. What are the options to protect an association and to protect its ops? Well, I've got some great ones here. So let's see what the first option to protect against cyber liability is. This is easy. Just do this. Follow a strict protocol of updating your IT variables to prepare for and ward off all relevant threats at all times, keeping up to date on a weekly basis on emerging threats and proactively implementing all recommended security protection protocols, either yourself or through your IT vendor. Easy. Just do that and you're set. Is there another option? Let's see. Yes. Invest in and hire in-house or outsourced personnel to run all IT risk protection protocols using a certified company available to protect from all vulnerabilities consistent with your evolving ways of doing work, including daily monitoring and coordinating action plans that will protect against changing contingencies, implementing software updates, patches, password hardening, and state-of-the-art hack proofing all systems. That's an option. Do that. I think you'd be in pretty good shape. That might be tough, though. Let's see what number 3 is. That's my favorite. Return to the golden days of yesteryear, operating with an IBM Selectric typewriter, US mail, Rolodex, and a rotary dial landline telephone. That should pretty much ward off most cyber threats. Pretty hard to hack an IBM Selectric typewriter. Well, if you don't like those 3, you could just give up. But more importantly, the solution that I wanted to talk with you about today is to consider insuring against the financial and liability fallout from cybersecurity through an affordable association cyber insurance policy. Why? Because they do just what we talked about and shift the financial burden to the insurance company, and they allow you to sleep and rest easy if you fail to do any of the prior 3. What is a cyber liability insurance policy? Well, cyber insurance, when a breach occurs, covers the range of expenses that arise from a breach. That includes identifying and solving the breach, recovering the data, notifying customers or impacted persons or entities, all public relations costs, possible credit monitoring expenses, legal expenses, fines from compliance regulators, and even paying the principal, the extortion costs due to ransomware, and also for general business interruption costs. Remember, that type of a liability, a cyber insurance breach, a cyber liability breach, is not covered under your general liability policy. So what is covered in a cyber liability policy? Well, there's two types of coverage: first party and third party. First party, that means for the association and its members, that covers your damages. It can include things like investigating any business interruption if it has impacted your ability to collect your dues or your assessments or anything else, and there are financial implications there that can be satisfied through the first party coverage, including data recovery. Third party coverage is the one that always gets my attention, because that's the one that is it's very difficult to quantify. This covers the damages to an association and its owners, lessors, property managers, and volunteers who might be affected by a cyber attack. So let's say there's a breach, a data breach, and you have a third party, any of the folks in these categories, or somebody not affiliated with the association who suffered damage as a result of that negligence and that breach. Well, the costs associated with that are high. That person will have a claim and a lawsuit against the association and its board of directors, and that lawsuit will require lots of money. Legal fees, settlement costs, the cost to defend it, security failures, media liabilities, all of that is covered under a cyber liability policy. Here's some of the typical ways of looking at it. So if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see cyber liability insurance. That's this round. This is what a cyber liability insurance policy does. Covers both internal and external sources. Okay, it's confidential. And look at the areas of coverage: loss of digital assets. Those are your electronic files. If you lose those, business interruption and extra expense, that's any lost income. The cyber extortion costs themselves, that's ransomware, what we call distributed denial of service costs, where you can't get into your system unless you pay a ransom. Associated security costs. The average, now this takes into consideration corporations as well, but the average in the United States is $1.1 million in security costs associated with data breaches in the United States. Non-employee privacy liability, that's for somebody who is not an employee or associated with the association, but has somehow been affected by the breach. And then, of course, employee privacy liability, that's the personal information that might get stolen or losses that might occur. And then you have electronic media liability. That's libel, slander, defamation, and other exposures and losses that are caused as a result of a data breach. And then cyber terrorism liability, that's using the internet to threaten or cause harm through intimidation. So I know that's a lot. It's a lot that's covered in that kind of a policy, but why is it important, and why in particular do we need to care about the response, which was item, I think, 4 or 5 on that prior list? Well, Florida statutes, that's the law of the state of Florida. And by the way, all states have something like this. Florida's is a fairly mature statute by comparison. 501.171 was enacted in 2014, and it's the data breach notification law. It says that any entity, which would mean an association, that acquires, maintains, stores, or even uses personal information must notify individuals in the state of unauthorized access to personal information in electronic form. Here it is. It requires a duty to protect against data breaches and to notify in the event of. So I've highlighted the relevant points here. Notice to individuals must be made. So if you have a cyber breach and there's a potential exposure, doesn't even have to be confirmed, just potential, the notice to the individuals, all individuals, must be made expeditiously and practical, no later than 30 days after determining the breach. Entities can receive 15 additional days, et cetera, et cetera. They must provide notice also to the Department of Legal Affairs if the breach affects more than 500 individuals. So that doesn't just mean members, that means the exposure of 500 potential individuals. depending on what type of breach and how deep and far and wide it went. And then there's some items about if it's more than 1,000 individuals. Notice is not required if an appropriate investigation and consultation with relevant government agencies determines that it has not and will not likely result in identity theft or other financial harm. So this is important to realize, that the notice requirement doesn't mean that harm has occurred, just that a breach has occurred and potential harm may. So these are the kinds of forensic and proactive regulatory compliance things that are led by and handled by and paid for by the insurance company if you have a policy. So dropping down a little bit, the failure to properly notify either the Department of Legal Affairs or any affected individuals may result in civil penalties of $1,000 per day for the time that it goes undisclosed for up to 30 days, and then $50,000 a day for each 30-day period thereafter, or $50,000 for each 30-day period thereafter, up to 180 days, not to exceed $500,000. So that's just one component. That's the duty to protect and notify, the regulatory compliance piece of it. The fines alone can run up to $500,000, not to mention the costs of actually doing and notifying. Very, very big stuff. So there are two ways to insure against cyber risk and liability. One is to simply purchase what's called an endorsement. This is adding on to your general liability. I told you that it's excluded, and it is on most, if not all, general liability policies. But it is possible to endorse a small amount of coverage onto your general liability or your directors and officers policy. You can make an endorsement, an add-on. It's not as good as, it's not as complete as a standalone policy, which we're going to talk about, but it gives you a little bit of protection, which is better than no protection. So it's available as included as an add-on to your existing policy. The coverage is more narrow. It's not flexible or customizable. It's a little less expensive, but not much. And you have to determine if it would follow along with your excess liability policy, which, if you have done a good job with your insurance program, you have one of those. So it should be a follow form endorsement, as we call it in the industry, if you're going to endorse. But I think the better option is what's called a full standalone cyber liability policy. This works independently of all the other coverages. It stands alone. It gives you much broader coverage. It's flexible, it's customizable. You can pick your limits, your types. You can completely design it to fit the scale of your association. It's a little more expensive, but it will often, if not usually, satisfy all of the underlying requirements for your excess liability policy and coverage. What does that mean? Well, if you've got $1 million cyber liability policy and a $15 million excess liability policy, then the one would be added to the 15. It would follow along, and you'd have a total of $16 million worth of coverage. And that is a good thing. Let's take a look at an endorsement real quickly, if I can get this to work. So Kathy Field Lloyd, do you see a cyber data compromise coverage document yet? If not, I would need to do one other click. She says no. How about now? Is that a yes? No, we're back to the thing. Let's see. Give me one more try. Give me a thumbs up when you see it. Okay, great. So there we have what's called an endorsement to a business owner's policy, a BOP. Some associations have written their program on a business owner's policy as opposed to a regular general liability property package type of program. If you have a BOP, here's one from Centauri, and you'll see each of these sections as I scroll down: response expenses, data compromise, forensic IT review. These are the things that we talked about. Here you see the legal review, notification to affected individuals, service to affected individuals, PR services, fines and penalties, reimbursement for cyber extortion expenses, that's the ransom, defense and liability, that's the cost of the legal defense in case you get sued, and on the endorsement goes. Now, typically these come in small increments, and as I said, they are not customizable, so they're perhaps not as good as what I'd like to look at now, which would be a full standalone cyber policy. And I'm just going to do it very quickly since we're a little bit short on time. I have two of them here. We're just going to take a look at this McGowan HOA cyber indication for 2021. Kathy, if you'll give me a thumbs up when you can see this one, I would appreciate it. It has an M, a green M in the left. Do you see that now? No, she says no. Give me one more moment. Do you see it now? No, stand by. Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. So this is a standalone policy, and I want to take this a little bit more slowly. It's for Any View Homeowners Association. Look at the insuring agreement on the left: information security and privacy liability, regulatory defense and penalties, website, PCI, computer breach, and on it goes. Here are a couple of options, and these are not an exhaustive list, but here are three options. One is for $250,000, one's for $500,000, one's for $1 million with varying deductibles, all of which can be designed. But here's the beauty of it. Look how affordable a policy like this is. $325 a year for this association for $250,000. And obviously we would recommend $1 million, so it would pick up where your umbrella leaves off, but $570. A really comprehensive standalone cyber liability insurance policy to do the things that we've talked about here for $1 million in most cases, and for most associations, very simply put, is under $1,000. Now that's not an official quote, but what I'm telling you is these are very affordable. Kathy, do you see my slideshow again? Yes, good. So it's a very, very affordable option. Let's talk about two things. I don't know if you remember this from a few years ago, but Target was one of the more public breaches that occurred. It was about 8 years ago. 41 million people were affected. They paid $18.5 million in state investigations. The losses were far greater. It was one of the largest retail cyber attacks in US history. Gateway credentials were stolen from a third-party HVAC vendor. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, it wasn't anything Target did wrong. It was one of their vendors, their air conditioning contractor, their HVAC vendor had credentials to do something on their system in order to get access so that they could perform air conditioning functions. Now, I don't recall whether it was a passcode or whatever it was, but it was the HVAC vendor that the cyber thieves identified and exploited their cyber architecture and then accessed Target. Well, Target did not have in place the kind of architecture that would have prevented that, and they became liable as a result. The terms of the settlement agreement required all of these things: develop, implement, maintain a comprehensive information program, employ an executive or an officer to execute it, hire an independent expert, on and on and on, millions and millions of dollars because of one incident where they failed to prevent the HVAC vendor from being a touch point, an access point for cyber thievery. Let me go back there because I just pulled yesterday. I don't have this on a slide, but just yesterday, if you're familiar with the insurance company CNA, now this is one of the leading companies that provides cyber liability insurance. They were hacked. They had their own systems hacked. And CNA, this is as of April 5th, they expect its corporate email and other functions to be fully operational soon as it continues recovery efforts. That's what we talked about, the cost of recovery efforts following a March 21 cyber attack. It's just now reestablishing email functionality, confirmed that the malware used by the threat actor, which included ransomware, did not contain the ability to automatically spread to any internal or external systems. The insurer said it's been following, listen to this, a phased approach: containment, remediation, restoration, forensic examination, and thorough data review process. and will notify any impacted parties as appropriate once the investigation is complete. That's exactly what we're talking about. Not even the insurance companies that insure against this are not safe from this incredible and proliferating exposure that unfortunately has become a reality in this day and age. So what can we do? Let's see if we can bring this to a conclusion. There are 7 keys to reducing your community association cyber risk. Kathy, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that slide? Thank you. First, develop a response plan. Association cyber liability response plan. Know what you're going to do. Obtain security software that is an endpoint where your PC, your server, your laptop, and your points of entry that have constant malware definitions and updates. Limit access to sensitive information inside your association. Protect all personal identifiable information. Encrypt it. Use what they call dual factor authentication. That's a key. Dual factor authentication. That also, you've probably seen that on some of your banking. I'm sure Kathy at Center State can tell you about dual factor authentication as she's nodding. And we did not coordinate that before this presentation, but we know that it's out there. But actually, that reminds me, when you talk about that, passwords are obviously, we're coming up to that, a key part of this as well. But educate yourself and your association and your property management team. You know, we're all in this together. Educate them about the social media privacy risks. You know, there's so much use of Facebook and Twitter and all these other accounts. These are entry points where information can be inadvertently provided, if not taken and or exploited. And that's important. Use strong and complex passwords. By the way, did you know that many hardware vendors use the same default password when you buy a new device? So if you fail to get your password set up quickly and early and you're using a default password, you've got the same default password that millions of other people have. Now, not hundreds of millions, but millions, lots of people. And the cyber thieves know this, and they are constantly mining cyberspace to find those areas where passwords are weak. It reminds me of one that I recently did, a software program where I used to have 3 or 4 characters. This one wanted 8 characters for the password. So I chose Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Those were my 8 characters. All right. Look, the bottom line is everybody can be a target. We want to use strong complex passwords and have at least 3 different sources of data recovery points, whether it's on the PC, a hard drive backup, or an external backup, or the cloud, or all 3 in conjunction. And as the question was asked earlier, using VPNs for remote access, very, very helpful and very important. Here are some final considerations. The pandemic, COVID-19, is worsening the risk. Why? Because we're all doing what we're doing right now, everything. And because of that, I have developed a phrase called the pajama principle, and I'm going to ask you all to sort of reject that. The pajama principle is, you know, we used to do meetings like this and things in person, face to face. Now they're being done in people are doing them in their pajamas from their living room. Well, we might be doing that physically, but when it comes to the intellectual approach, to the psychological approach, we have to kind of reject that and remember that we need to be on guard more than ever, not in the pajamas. We don't need to have our brain in our pajamas. We need to be vigilant in this day and age. We want to move from liability to viability. We do that through the kinds of programs that I am recommending. We need to know who owns or who leases my hardware. If you're leasing hardware, if you're leasing computer systems, those contracts are important. Are there protections in place there if something that has been leased to you contained a hidden malware or virus that you did not know about that then exploited your network or your systems? And when buying new hardware, like I mentioned, that default password got to be changed. Make sure your information management and your security mindset follows you home, because the ethical obligations to make sure that those are best in class, those do follow you home now. Underwriting for insurance policies, particularly cyber liability policies, now more rigorous than ever. They're scrutinizing company protocols when underwriting policies, and they know that these are vulnerable points. So they've developed some great programs, but you'll need to have some pretty good systems in place as well in order to qualify. And remember, one size does not fit all on those, which is why a customizable standalone policy probably makes the most sense for most associations if you end up considering it. So when you take reasonable steps within your association to mitigate risk and you place a cyber liability insurance policy into your risk program, then you've probably already met the important ethical standard of care for your industry. So even if you don't do all those other things, with the architecture and the VPNs and the hardware, if you simply place this type of policy into your program, you have probably discharged your standard of care. And if nothing else, you have changed who will pay for it, for a breach thereof, from the association and its membership to the insurance company where it properly belongs, and at a very reasonable price these days. More importantly, you've taken the most important step in ensuring that your association remains viable and financially sound, even if faced with an unexpected internal or external cyber threat or data breach event. Stephen Wright is one of my favorite comedians. He says, experience is something you get just after you need it. And that's the truth. We don't want to be in that position with cyber liability, exposure, risk, and insurance. We want to get it before we need it, so it's there when we do need it. And with that, we can take some questions for just a minute or two, and I will say thank you for your time in advance. Are there any questions before I hand it over to Donna Hamilton? Thank you, by the way, for sitting through a fairly long presentation, but these are new terms. This is an emerging threat. It's an important one, and since associations have been at the epicenter of some of these threats, we want to make sure that we get the word out and you contact your insurance agent for this type of policy, or have the one that you have reviewed, whatever you need, and we would be delighted to help you here at Patriot Insurance as well. So I don't see any other questions. If one pops up, we can come back to it. Oh, I see a hand from Kathy Field Lloyd, so we'll try it that way. Kathy, go right ahead.
Let's say, Chris, that you purchased the policy and then you have some kind of a breach. Does the insurance company that you've purchased the policy with help walk you through those steps that you mentioned that you have to go through following one, or do they pay for a lawyer that will help you do that?
That is precisely what they do, and the answer is yes and yes. They do both. The insurance company itself walks hand in hand with the association to investigate, mitigate, and respond to that threat. The legal counsel that then is provided is also to defend against and to represent the association and its board against the civil claims for financial losses that come from any affected people. So the answer is yes to both, and that is one of the great advantages. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Well, I certainly hope that you learned something today that you didn't know about. And even if you didn't, if this has raised your awareness about this emerging threat, it's something that we are seeing all the time. We're seeing it literally on a weekly basis, both on the personal side, just from any homeowner USA, to the associations and corporations and vendors. We're seeing it at every point. I can tell you that in our area within 5 square miles, 2 different dentist offices in the last 60 days were completely shut down due to a ransomware attack. One had a policy, one did not. That's a tale of 2 dentists, and I can tell you that one had a complete disruption in their business for a very significant period of time. The other did not. The other had a very short and minimal disruption, and were able to respond very quickly. But those types of anecdotal cases are happening with greater and greater frequency. So I'm grateful to the forum, to Center State Bank, to the Juno Beach Civic Association for the time to visit with you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And without further ado, here's Donna Hamilton to bring today's meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Really, really appreciate that well thought out and informative presentation. I also want to thank Kathy Dorn from Center State Bank for your continued support and sponsorship. We we could not do these programs without you. And of course, to Kathy Field Lloyd and her amazing team, Kathy Dorn and David Cox, for spending their time to research and put these programs together. I just wanted to remind you that the next two upcoming programs on April 14th and also the 21st will be coming up shortly, and you'll be getting a notice with the information to proceed. So let's all be vigilant, informed, and mindful. And as always, be kind. So thank you so much. And we look forward to all of you. And we appreciate the Homeowners Association board members for being here to represent their communities. Thank you so much. Bye.